Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into feudal Japan, into a world of clanking armor, smoky torchlight, and a boy who will one day become the richest man in the country, feared by warlords twice his rank. You can almost hear it already. The creak of wooden floors in a castle that's seen too many winters, the distant clash of practiced swords, the smell of horse and pine smoke drifting through an open doorway. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. It's always strange to think how many different moments in the world are happening at once while we sit here together. Let me know, too, what piece of history you'd like me to wander into next. Who knows? Your idea might be the very next journey we take. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It's the middle of the 16th century, and you are 12 years old, standing in a courtyard in Owari province with your hands folded and your knees slightly locked, because someone told you locked knees looked more disciplined. You don't yet know if that's true. You just know you're not allowed to fidget. Not in front of him. Him being Oda Nobunaga. Even now, before the legends, before the wars that will tear the old order apart and hand you a fortune beyond counting, there's something about the way he looks at people. Like he's already decided what they're worth, and is simply waiting for them to prove it. You've heard the older pages whisper that he tests horses by riding them straight through a burning field. You don't know if that's true either. With Nobunaga, you've learned, the wild stories tend to be the accurate ones. You've come here as a page, which sounds humble, and mostly is. You carry things. You wait outside doors. You memorize where every retainer sleeps and which of them snore loudly enough to matter if there's ever a night attack. It's less romantic than it sounds, standing at the edge of somebody else's history holding a tray of rice. But you notice things. That's the part nobody warns you about. How much of a warlord's household runs on the noticing. Whose sandals are worn on the left side, meaning they favor a weak knee. Which retainer's hands shake slightly before a meeting, meaning he's about to ask for money. You file it all away without quite meaning to, the way a habit forms before you've decided to have it. There's another boy who cycles through this same courtyard, a few years older than you, thin and quick-tongued, with a face that seems built for grinning even when nothing's funny. Nobunaga calls him Saru. The monkey, half insult, half fondness, and the boy wears it like a badge instead of flinching. He talks constantly. He talks his way out of punishments into favors around problems that would flatten anyone else. You watch him work a room the way some men work a sword, and you think, privately, that you could never do that. You're not built for talking your way anywhere. What you have instead is a spear. A long, unglamorous length of wood and steel that you've been drilling with since before you can remember choosing to. It's not affection exactly the way you hold it. It's closer to trust. A spear doesn't lie to you about distance the way people sometimes do. Nobunaga notices this too eventually, the quiet and the discipline, and the way you seem to disappear into a room until the exact moment you're needed. He starts calling you Inu, the dog. And here's the thing historians still go back and forth on. Whether that name was meant as an insult, the way you dismiss someone as a mere animal following at heel, or whether it was something gentler, a nod to loyalty that never wavered, even when it would have been easier to. Nobody's fully settled that argument, and honestly, sitting here in this courtyard, neither have you. What you do know is that you and the monkey, this loud, clever, endlessly talkative boy who will one day help reshape the entire country, have become something like friends, in that specific way that happens between two people who couldn't be more different and somehow understand each other anyway. Dogs and monkeys, the old sayings go, don't get along. You'll spend the rest of your lives quietly proving that wrong. For now, though, none of that has happened yet. Right now, you're just a boy carrying trays and counting sandals and holding a spear like it's the only steady thing in a very unsteady world. Nobody in this courtyard tonight knows that you're standing at the very beginning of a story that will end with you commanding thousands, ruling provinces richer than most kings could dream of, and becoming so powerful that a future shogun, a man who doesn't yet exist in anyone's plans, will lie awake at night wondering if you're the one obstacle he can't remove. There's a particular kind of dress code you've adopted lately, one that makes the older retainers sigh whenever you walk past. Bright colors, oversized sleeves, a sword worn at an angle that serves no practical purpose except looking dangerous. The other young pages who dress this way get called kabukimono, the tilted ones, the ones who lean askew from how a proper young samurai is supposed to carry himself. Nobunaga, oddly, doesn't seem to mind. Maybe because he recognizes it. Maybe because a man planning to burn down the old rules of Japan doesn't have much room to criticize a boy for wearing his collar too loose. The night settles in properly now, torches burning low along the walls, the courtyard emptying out one servant at a time. Somewhere close by, a horse shifts its weight in the stable, and the sound carries strange and hollow across the packed earth. You should sleep. Tomorrow there will be more trays to carry, more sandals to study, more of this slow, patient apprenticeship in noticing everything and saying almost nothing. You have no way of knowing yet how far this apprenticeship will carry you. Not tonight. Tonight you're simply 12, and tired, and standing very still in a world that hasn't yet decided what to make of you. Though, it won't take long to find out. 2 years pass, the way they do at that age, slowly in the moment, and then suddenly gone. You've grown taller. Your voice has settled into something lower, and the spear that once felt like a formality now feels like an extension of your own arm. Something you reach for the way another person reaches for a doorframe to steady themselves. Owari, it turns out, is not a peaceful place to grow up in. The clan you serve is still tightening its grip on its own house before it can even think about anyone else's. Brothers distrust brothers. Cousins raise armies against cousins. It's the kind of quiet civil unrest that never makes it into the grand stories later. The unglamorous business of a warlord securing his own family before he can dream of securing a country. You're 18 now, and old enough to be trusted with more than trays and sandals. You're old enough to be handed a spear and pointed toward a battlefield. Kayazu doesn't sound like much when someone says it out loud. It won't be remembered the way the great battles will, the ones with names that get carved into monuments and repeated in taverns for centuries. It's a skirmish, really. One more flare-up in a long season of them, part of the internal struggle to settle who actually commands Owari. But you don't know yet which battles history keeps and which ones it quietly lets go. To you right now, this is the only battle that exists. The morning has that particular gray stillness that settles over a field before anyone's decided to break it. You can smell wet earth and horse sweat, and somewhere behind you, a retainer is muttering a prayer under his breath, fast and low, the words blurring into each other. You don't pray. You've never quite known what to say. Then the stillness breaks, the way it always does, not gradually, but all at once, like a held breath finally letting go. Shouting, the dull thud of feet against packed ground. You move forward with the others, spear low, eyes scanning for shapes in the chaos rather than faces, because faces slow you down and shapes don't. And then something changes in your vision. A flash, a streak, and heat blooms across the side of your face before the sound of it even registers. An arrow. Not a killing shot, not quite, but close enough that the difference feels almost arbitrary. Your cheek is on fire. There's a warmth spreading down your jaw that you'll later realize is blood, though in the moment it just feels like your whole face has been dipped in something scalding. Here's the strange thing nobody tells you about pain like this. It doesn't slow you down. It sharpens you. The ringing in your ear, the coppery taste creeping into the corner of your mouth. All of it collapses into a single, narrow point of focus, and that point is the archer standing maybe 30 paces off, already knocking another arrow, already assuming the first one did its job. He assumed wrong. You don't remember deciding to run at him. That's the honest truth of it. One you'll turn over in your mind for years afterward. There's the shot, and then there's you, closing the distance faster than a person with a hole newly torn in his face has any right to move, spear leveled, vision tunneling until the archer is the only thing left in the world. He gets the second arrow off. You'll carry a fate scar to prove it, or maybe you already have that scar, and this is simply confirmation that the world doesn't owe you fairness, or it goes somewhere you don't have time to register, because by then you're already on him. It's over fast, faster than the fear leading up to it. There's a specific kind of silence that follows a fight like that, a ringing quiet where your own heartbeat is the loudest thing left standing. You'll hear later that some of the older retainers went back to the site afterward just to see it for themselves. The boy who took an arrow to the face and didn't fall down, didn't even stumble, just went and finished the job with his spear like the wound was someone else's problem entirely. Whether that detail is exactly true is one of those small threads historians still tug at when they revisit the old Maeda family chronicles, written down generations later by clan scribes who had every reason to make their founder sound a little more invincible than he probably was. Maybe the wound was worse than the records admit. Maybe it was less. What's harder to dispute is that something about you, on that field, in that ordinary little skirmish nobody would remember, started to solidify into a reputation. You walk back to camp with blood drying stiff along your jaw, and nobody offers to help you walk straighter. Nobody needs to. There's a particular way soldiers look at a person after something like this. Not quite awe, not quite respect, something more practical than either. It's the look of men mentally filing you under a new category, not the quiet page who carries trays anymore. Someone else now. The healer who stitches your cheek that evening works by lamplight, humming something tuneless under his breath. And the whole tent smells of crushed herbs and hot metal instruments. It stings in a way that makes your eyes water, though you'd never admit that to anyone. And you sit very still while he works, the same stillness you learned standing in courtyards holding trays, except now it's serving a different purpose. It's a strange thing, growing into a name before you fully earned it. Somewhere in the months that follow, the whispers about the spear you carry, the one you've never once misplaced, never once hesitated with, start attaching themselves to something more permanent. Mataza, they'll eventually call you. Mataza with the spear. It's not official yet, not carved into anything, but names like that rarely announce themselves. They accumulate, quietly, the way frost builds on a window overnight. Until one morning you look, and it's simply there, fully formed, as if it had always belonged to you. You don't feel especially fearsome tonight, lying in the dark with a bandaged cheek throbbing in time with your pulse. You feel tired, mostly, and a little bit surprised at yourself, the way you might be surprised to learn you're capable of lifting something heavier than you expected. Outside the tent, the camp settles into its nighttime rhythms. Low conversation, the occasional laugh, the shuffle of someone repositioning by the fire. It's almost peaceful, if you let yourself stop replaying the last hour over and over. Tomorrow there will be more marching, more small unnamed skirmishes in this long, slow contest to secure a single province before anyone can even think about the rest of the country. But tonight, you let the ringing in your ear fade into something softer, and you let your eyes close on the strange, unfamiliar weight of being someone other soldiers are starting to watch a little more carefully. There's a version of you that exists only in flashes of temper, and you've never quite made peace with him. Most days, he stays quiet, tucked somewhere behind the careful, watchful young man who counts sandals and reads the room before he ever opens his mouth. But every so often, something cracks that composure clean open, and what's underneath surprises even you. A year or so has passed since Ieyasu, The scar along your jaw has settled into something pale and permanent, a thin line you catch sight of sometimes in polished metal and barely register anymore. You're older now, more established, trusted with responsibilities that would have seemed unthinkable when you were still carrying trays across that courtyard. And yet something restless has taken root in you, a coiled tightness that doesn't have an obvious outlet in peacetime. Soldiers built for battle don't always know what to do with themselves when there isn't one. The evening in question starts unremarkably. There's a gathering, one of those loose informal affairs where retainers relax, drink a little too freely, and let the rigid hierarchies of the day soften around the edges. A doboshu is present, one of the officials responsible for organizing entertainment, arranging the small comforts and diversions that keep a warlord's household from feeling like a permanent barracks, is to make evenings like this one pleasant. He is not on this particular night especially good at his job. Or perhaps he is fine at it and simply says the wrong thing to the wrong man at the wrong moment, which happens more often in history than grand betrayals ever do. Historians still debate exactly what set you off. Some accounts suggest an insult aimed at your dignity, others a dispute over some trivial matter of protocol that spiraled far past its actual size. What survives isn't the substance of the argument, it's the outcome. Words escalate. You can feel it building the way you might feel weather changing, a pressure behind your eyes that has nothing to do with reason and everything to do with the particular kind of pride young men carry when they've just started earning a reputation and haven't yet learned how fragile reputations are to protect. The doboshu says something dismissive, mocking, exactly wrong, and something in you that has been coiled tight since long before tonight simply lets go. It happens fast, the way violence born from anger always does, faster than the version of it you'll replay in your memory for years afterward, slowed down and second-guessed 100 different ways. When it's over, the man is dead, and the room around you has gone utterly silent in that specific suffocating way that follows an act nobody in the room can undo. There's no glory in this one, no enemy archer to chase down and justify the violence as combat. Just a dead official, a room full of witnesses, and you standing there with your hands still trembling from something that isn't quite adrenaline and isn't quite regret, though it will curdle into something close to regret before the night is through. Word reaches Nobunaga quickly, the way bad news always travels faster than good. You're not summoned, so much as you simply understand, from the shift in how people look at you over the following hours, that a decision has already been made above your head. Killing a household official over a personal grievance isn't the kind of thing a lord can quietly overlook, not even for a retainer who's proven himself with a spear. Discipline matters more than talent, in a court like this one, maybe especially for a retainer who's proven himself, since talent unchecked by discipline is exactly the kind of thing that eventually turns dangerous to the man holding the leash. The banishment, when it comes, is delivered without much ceremony. You are no longer welcome in Nobunaga's service. Whatever affection existed in that nickname, the dog, loyal and quiet, does nothing to soften the verdict. If anything, it makes the fall feel sharper, the way it always stings more to disappoint someone who once trusted you than someone who never did. You leave with almost nothing. No official rank, no household to answer to, no lord's banner to march beneath. Just your spear, a bag of what few possessions matter enough to carry, and the particular, hollow disorientation of a young man who built his entire sense of self around service and now has nothing left to serve. Ronin is the word for what you've become, and it's not a comfortable one. It carries the smell of failure, even when circumstances complicate the blame. You wander the outskirts of territory that used to feel like home, sleeping in places that offer little more than a roof, and sometimes not even that, watching from a careful distance as the war games you once had a stake in continue on without you. There's a particular cruelty in exile from a world still visible on the horizon, near enough to watch, too far to touch. Nights stretch long during this stretch of your life, longer than they ever did in the barracks. where exhaustion used to pull you under fast and dreamless. Now you lie awake more often than not, turning the whole ugly incident over and over, searching for the version of that night where you kept your composure, where the argument dissolved into nothing the way most arguments do. That version doesn't exist. You've checked. There's a temptation, in stories told long after the fact, to smooth over a chapter like this one, to frame it as a noble injustice, a talented man wronged by circumstance, rather than what it actually is, a costly failure of temper that very nearly erased everything you'd built. The clan chronicles written generations later tend to gloss past the uglier details, the way family histories often do. But sitting here, in the actual dirt and cold of actual exile, there's no smoothing it over. You did this. Nobody handed you this ruin. You built it yourself, in a single unguarded moment. And now you have to decide what to do with the wreckage. What you decide, somewhere in the long sleepless nights that follow, is that you're not finished. Whatever door has closed behind you, you're not going to sit outside it waiting politely to be let back in. If redemption is possible at all, it isn't going to arrive through patience. It's going to have to be earned, loudly, in a way nobody can ignore or dismiss. You don't know yet what that will look like. You don't know that a battle is coming, one that will become so famous historians centuries later will still be arguing over exactly how it unfolded, and that you're about to insert yourself into it uninvited, unpaid, and unsanctioned, simply because standing on the sidelines has become unbearable. For now, though, there's only the cold ground beneath you and the spear resting close enough to touch, and the quiet, stubborn refusal to let one terrible night be the whole of your story. Somewhere out past the tree line, campfires flicker from an army that used to be yours. You watch them for a long while before finally letting your eyes close, already turning over the shape of whatever comes next. Rumors travel strange distances when you're living on the margins of a world you used to belong to. You hear about the Imagawa long before you understand exactly what's coming. A name spoken with a particular weight by other wandering men you cross paths with. The kind of weight reserved for a force nobody expects to lose. Imagawa Yoshimoto is marching through, they say, with numbers that make Nobunaga's own forces look almost laughable by comparison. It's less an invasion than an inevitability, the way people describe it. A formality before the province changes hands. You've spent the recent stretch of your exile drifting close to the edges of territory you no longer have any claim to. Unable to fully let go of a world that no longer wants you in it. So when word spreads that Nobunaga's forces are gathering to make some kind of desperate stand, something in you doesn't hesitate the way it probably should. Nobody asked you to be here. That's worth sitting with for a moment. There's no banner over your head, no rank pinned to your shoulder, no lord's coin promised for your trouble. You're simply here, uninvited, because the alternative, watching from a safe distance while the only world you've ever wanted back stands on the edge of annihilation, has become impossible to stomach. The terrain around Okehazama is nothing dramatic to look at. The kind of ground that swallows sound and hides movement in ways open fields never could. There's a heaviness to the air that has nothing to do with weather, a stillness that feels deliberate, like the whole valley is holding its breath along with everyone inside it. You position yourself where the fighting looks likely to be thickest, which is its own kind of strategy for a man with nothing left to lose and everything left to prove. If you're going to insert yourself into a battle nobody invited you to, you might as well make sure nobody can pretend afterward that you weren't there. What happens next unfolds the way most real battles do, not as one clean sweeping motion, but as a series of brutal, disorienting fragments that only make sense once they're strung together afterward by people who weren't in the middle of them. Rain, some accounts claim, hammering down at exactly the wrong or exactly the right moment, turning the ground slick and the visibility worse. Whether the storm was quite as dramatic as later storytellers made it out to be is one of those details historians still argue over. The kind of embellishment that tends to accumulate around any victory improbable enough to need explaining. What isn't in dispute is the outcome. Nobunaga's smaller, badly outnumbered force strikes the Imagawa camp with a speed and violence nobody on the other side anticipated. And somewhere in the chaos of that strike, you are exactly where you meant to be. In the thick of it. Spear moving on instinct built from years of drilling, and one very memorable arrow wound that taught you pain doesn't have to slow you down. You don't fight for glory in the way that word usually gets used. You fight with the specific, narrow focus of a man trying to prove something to a lord who no longer employs him, which turns out to be a more dangerous motivation than any battle cry. Enemy after enemy comes at you out of the wet, tangled undergrowth, and each one becomes briefly the only thing that exists. The same tunnel vision you found yourself in years ago, chasing down an archer with blood streaming down your face. It's a state you've learned to recognize now, instead of simply falling into by accident. Almost a tool at this point, rather than a reflex. Word arrives eventually, cutting through the noise of the retreating enemy. Imagawa Yoshimoto himself is dead, cut down in the confusion, and with him dies whatever certainty this battle was supposed to have. What was meant to be a formality has become one of the most stunning reversals anyone present will ever witness. The kind of victory that seems to defy the actual arithmetic of the two armies involved. You stand in the aftermath, breathing hard, surrounded by the particular quiet that settles over a battlefield once the shouting stops. Not silence exactly, but a low murmur of moaning wounded, distant shouted orders, the wet, heavy stillness of a place that's just changed history without fully realizing it yet. And then comes the part that matters most for you personally, the part that has nothing to do with the fate of provinces and everything to do with your own narrow, private war to be let back inside a door that closed on you. You gather what you need. 3 heads taken from enemy dead you can genuinely claim. Proof carried the way soldiers of this era prove anything. Grim, practical, unambiguous. It's not a pleasant task, and there's no pretending otherwise, no softening it with poetic language that would have felt false to the men actually living through it. It's simply what victory required as evidence. In a world where words alone rarely carried enough weight, you present them to Nobunaga. There's no dramatic speech in this moment, no tearful reconciliation of the kind later storytellers might have been tempted to invent. What there is instead is something quieter and in some ways more meaningful. A long look from a man who doesn't often extend second chances, weighing what's in front of him against what he remembers about the young man who once served him loyally enough to earn a nickname, and violently enough to lose everything over one bad night. He doesn't fully reinstate you, not yet. That's a detail worth sitting with rather than rushing past. This isn't the tidy redemption arc it might become in the retelling. What you earn today is something smaller and more provisional. A crack in a door that had seemed permanently shut. Proof that whatever ruin you brought on yourself hasn't erased whatever value you once had. It's not everything, but it's not nothing either. And after the long, cold stretch of exile, not nothing feels like an enormous amount. You walk away from the field that evening, carrying an exhaustion that goes deeper than the physical kind. The specific tiredness of a person who has spent months holding themselves rigid against despair, finally allowed to let some of that rigidity go. The camp around you buzzes with the disbelieving energy of an army that just won a battle it wasn't supposed to survive, let alone win. And somewhere in that buzz, quietly, unofficially, you allow yourself to feel something you haven't let yourself feel in a long while. Hope, maybe, or something close enough to it. There's still a long road ahead before that door swings fully open again. More battles, more proof required, more patient, unglamorous work rebuilding what one furious night undid. But for the first time since your exile began, the road actually seems to lead somewhere, rather than simply stretching out into more of the same cold uncertainty. You settle in near the edge of camp as the fires die down around you, listening to the low murmur of soldiers still trading disbelieving accounts of the day. And for once, Your part in it goes largely unspoken, unclaimed, exactly the way an uninvited volunteer's part probably should. That's fine. You didn't come here for the story to be about you. You came here to prove there was still a place for you in the one that already existed. The full reinstatement doesn't come wrapped in ceremony either, as it turns out. That seems to be a pattern with Nobunaga. The man deals in results, not gestures. And results are exactly what the next year hands you the chance to provide. The campaign that takes shape is aimed at Mino, a province that's been a thorn in Nobunaga's side for longer than you've been alive. Ruled by a family with no intention of yielding it peacefully, you're brought along in a role that's still not quite official, still not quite trusted. The kind of half-status that leaves you standing slightly apart from the properly ranked retainers, even as you march in the same column toward the same fight. There's a particular discomfort to that in-between space, one you've had plenty of time to get used to since Okihazama. Not banished, not embraced. Tolerated, provisionally, on the strength of 3 heads, and whatever goodwill your old nickname still carries. It would be easy to let that ambiguity make you cautious, to hang back and protect what fragile standing you've clawed together, rather than risk it on anything reckless. You've never been especially good at caution, though. That's more or less the whole story of how you ended up here in the first place. The engagement near Moribei unfolds with the particular chaos of contested territory. Smaller skirmishes bleeding into each other, across uneven ground. Orders shouted and half heard over the din. Dust kicked up thick enough to catch in your throat. Somewhere in the middle of it, you find yourself facing down 2 samurai of real reputation, men whose names carry weight even among Nobunaga's own officers. The kind of opponents a still unproven retainer might reasonably choose to avoid. You don't avoid them. What follows isn't elegant. Combat at this level rarely is, whatever the later storytellers might imply with their clean, choreographed descriptions. It's breathless and ugly, and entirely dependent on which of you tires first, which of you reads the next motion half a second faster than the other. Your spear finds its mark against the first man in a moment that feels less like skill than luck holding its breath just long enough for skill to catch up. The second comes at you almost immediately after. No pause to recover, no chance to feel anything about the first before the next threat is already closing the distance. By the time it's over, you're standing over 2 bodies that belonged, until very recently, to men whose deaths will actually be noticed and spoken of. A different category entirely from the anonymous enemy dead you claimed at Okihazama. This is the kind of victory that gets reported up a chain of command, that gets discussed by officers who matter. That gets back to Nobunaga in terms specific enough that he can't simply file it away as one more piece of battlefield noise. And this time, when the acknowledgement comes, it isn't provisional. You're welcomed back properly, full status restored. Your place among Nobunaga's retainers no longer something you have to prove with every single engagement. There's a particular lightness to that, one that catches you slightly off guard the first morning you wake up and realize you no longer need to calculate your worth before opening your mouth in a room full of other officers. It's strange how quickly a person can forget what it felt like to belong somewhere, and how sharply that memory returns once belonging is handed back. Years pass in the way that years tend to during a period of expansion, full of movement, campaigns folding into each other, territory changing hands with a regularity that would have seemed unthinkable back when you were an anxious page memorizing sandalwear patterns in a quiet courtyard. Nobunaga's ambitions have stopped being contained to Owari and its immediate neighbors. He's reaching further now, toward rivals who once seemed untouchable. And the retainers closest to him are being reorganized into something sharper, more deliberate. You're folded into a unit that carries a certain unmistakable presence on the field. The Aka Horoshu, distinguished by red cloaks that mark you out even at a distance, an elite guard, reserved for retainers Nobunaga trusts enough to keep close during the fighting that matters most. It's an honor, though. Nobody phrases it that way out loud. Recognition in this world rarely arrives as a compliment. It arrives as an assignment. A new set of dangers you're now considered capable enough to be handed. Onagawa, when it comes, is nothing like the tangled wooded chaos of Okehazama. This is open ground along a riverbank, visibility stretching for a considerable distance in every direction, armies arrayed against each other in numbers vastly greater than anything you fought through in your ronin days. The Azai and Asakura forces have allied against Nobunaga, and the scale of what's about to happen is obvious just from the sheer density of banners crowding the horizon on both sides. There's a particular sound to a battle this size before it actually starts. A low, layered hum made up of thousands of individual conversations, prayers, adjustments of armor, horses shifting and snorting against their restraints. All of it blending into something almost like weather. You've learned to use that stretch of waiting rather than dread it, running through the same mental inventory you've built over years now. Footing, wind direction, which of the men near you tend to hesitate and which tend to overcommit. The fighting, once it breaks, spreads across the riverbank in a way that makes it hard to track anything beyond your own immediate patch of chaos. Water churns reddish-brown, where combat has crossed into the shallows. The red cloak on your shoulders marks you as a target as much as an honor, and you're aware of that the whole time, a low hum of exposure, sitting underneath every strike and parry. You distinguish yourself here in ways that don't require quite the same desperate proving as Okehazama did. Not because the stakes are lower, but because you're no longer fighting to earn a place. You're fighting from inside one. And there's a difference in how that settles in the body. A steadiness that wasn't available to you as an outsider clawing his way back in. By the time the fighting along the river finally exhausts itself, the Azai and Asakura forces are broken badly enough that the balance of power in the region has shifted decisively in Nobunaga's favor. You walk away from the riverbank soaked through, exhausted in that specific bone-deep way that follows a battle fought at true scale rather than a skirmish, and there's a moment, crossing back toward camp as evening settles in, where you catch sight of your own reflection in a still patch of water along the bank. The face, looking back, is older than the one that used to stand rigid in that courtyard holding trays. The scar along your jaw has faded into something you barely notice anymore. What's changed more than the face, though, is what sits behind it. A kind of settled certainty that wasn't there before, earned through exile and redemption, and now this. Standing shoulder to shoulder with men whose trust you no longer have to fight for. You don't know it yet, but the quiet, administrative years ahead, put down uprisings, garrison duty, unglamorous work far from the drama of a battle like Onagawa, are about to teach you something just as valuable as any of the fighting has. How to hold territory once it's won. How to manage men, not just lead them. Skills that won't make for dramatic retellings around a fire, but that will, eventually, matter more than almost anything else you've learned so far. You let yourself simply feel the relief of having survived something enormous. The cold water still clinging to your armor. The low murmur of an army settling into camp around you. Grateful and reflective in the particular way soldiers get, after they've looked at a battlefield too large to fully comprehend, and lived to walk away from it anyway. There's a specific quiet that settles over a household in the hours after a husband returns from something like Onagawa. Not silence exactly, but a kind of hush that lets the ordinary sounds of a home feel almost overwhelming after weeks of nothing but war. The creak of a floorboard, the soft clatter of someone setting down a tray, a child's laughter from somewhere down the hall, muffled by distance and walls. Matsu meets you at the entrance before you've even had the chance to remove your armor properly, and there's no dramatic embrace, no tearful reunion of the kind later storytellers might have wanted to invent. What there is instead is a quick, assessing glance, checking you over the way she'd check a horse after a hard ride, looking for anything torn or bleeding that you might be too stubborn to mention yourself. She simply turns and starts issuing instructions to the household staff about baths and food, as though you've been gone an afternoon rather than a season. You've known her since you were both barely more than children, raised in overlapping circles, the way arranged futures often are, in a world like this one, and there was never a dramatic courtship to speak of, was something that took root slowly and turned out to be sturdier than the more theatrical version might have been. A familiarity built out of years, rather than the fragile heat of something new. What surprised people who didn't know either of you well, back when the marriage was still fresh, was that Matsu had no particular interest in staying confined to the quiet, decorative role a lord's wife was generally expected to occupy. She'd trained with a bow since she was young, and not in the polite, ceremonial way some noble women dabbled in archery for appearances. She was genuinely skilled, the kind of skill that comes from actual repetition rather than inherited grace, arrows landing with a consistency that would embarrass more than a few of your own retainers if they were foolish enough to challenge her. It's an odd thing, watching your household run through her hands while you're away at war, and an even odder thing to admit, if you're honest with yourself, in the quiet of your own thoughts, where nobody else can hear the admission, that it runs better in her hands than it would in most men's. There's a particular efficiency to how she manages things, an instinct for logistics that seems to come as naturally to her as the archery does. Grain stores, troop provisions, the endless, unglamorous math of feeding and equipping men who are somewhere else entirely, fighting battles she isn't present for, but somehow still shapes the outcome of. You'll come to rely on this more than either of you probably expected when you were first paired together as children. There will be a campaign, further down the road than you can currently see, where the numbers involved stretch past 20,000 men, an entire army's worth of mouths to feed, weapons to supply, wounded to tend to, and it will be Matsu coordinating the rear support that keeps that army functional, while you and the rest of the fighting men are occupied with the parts of war that get remembered in psalms. Nobody writes psalms about grain requisitions. They should, honestly. An army that starves loses just as thoroughly as an army that's outfought, and somebody has to make sure that never becomes the reason for a defeat. There's a particular kind of respect that develops between two people who've watched each other work under pressure. One that doesn't always look like tenderness from the outside, but runs just as deep, maybe deeper for being tested so consistently. You've seen her calm a household in the middle of a genuine crisis. Bad news from the front, a fire in one of the outbuildings, an unexpected arrival of guests who needed housing on no notice at all, with the same unhurried steadiness you try to bring to a battlefield. It occurs to you more than once that you married someone every bit as formidable as any retainer under your command, just pointed in a different direction. The household is filling now with children, one after another, in the particular blur that early parenthood tends to become when you're also spending half your time at war. You're not always present for the small milestones, first steps, first words, the way you might want to be, and there's a specific, quiet guilt that comes with that absence. One you don't discuss much with anyone, because there isn't really a solution to offer alongside the apology. War doesn't pause for a child learning to walk, but you notice in the stretches of time you are home how the household has started to take on a particular character. Loud in places, disciplined in others, a strange and functional blend of martial rigor and genuine warmth that seems to trace back mostly to Matsu's steady hand rather than yours. The older children are already showing signs of the temperaments that will define them later. One quiet and watchful, in a way that reminds you uncomfortably of yourself at that age. Another with an energy that seems impossible to fully contain. More like the boisterous, talkative friend you made years ago in a courtyard holding trays than like either of his actual parents. You'll have many children eventually, more than either of you probably expected when you were first matched together as young, half-formed versions of the people you'd become. Sons who will grow into positions of real authority, carrying the name forward in ways you can't yet fully picture. Daughters who will be married into some of the most powerful families in the country, their futures used as careful, deliberate threads woven into alliances that keep the whole fragile political fabric of this era from tearing apart. It's not romantic framed that way, and you're aware of that. Marriage in this world is rarely just about affection. It's architecture, as much as anything else. Beams and joints holding a larger structure together. And yet, sitting here in the relative quiet of an evening at home, watching Matsu review household ledgers with the same focused intensity she'd bring to planning a defense, it's hard not to feel that whatever this marriage started as, it's become something more than architecture. There's an ease between you that took years to build, and shows no particular signs of wearing thin. She doesn't flatter you, doesn't perform deference the way some might expect of a lord's wife. She tells you plainly when she thinks you're wrong, which happens more often than your pride would prefer to admit, and you've learned, slowly and sometimes reluctantly, that she's usually right. There's a comfort in that, one you didn't fully appreciate until you'd spent enough seasons away at war to understand what it means to come home to someone who runs the household, not as a caretaker waiting for your return, but as a genuine partner managing her own share of a much larger shared undertaking. Somewhere down the corridor, one of the children is being coaxed toward bed, voices rising and falling in that particular rhythm of bargaining that happens in every household with young children in it, regardless of how many provinces the parents happen to command between them. You let yourself sit with that sound for a while, before returning to your own evening tasks, letting the ordinary noise of a full, functioning household settle over you like something warm after a long stretch of cold. Whatever comes next, and something always comes next, in a life shaped as thoroughly by war as yours has been. There's a steadiness here, in this house, in this partnership, that you suspect will end up mattering more to the eventual shape of your legacy than any single battle you've fought so far. Peace, when it comes at all in this stretch of your life, never lasts long enough to fully settle into. There's always another fire somewhere on the map, another region that hasn't yet learned to bend to Nobunaga's growing reach, and Ekizen turns out to be one of the more stubborn ones. The trouble there isn't a rival warlord in the conventional sense. It's something harder to fight cleanly, a religious uprising, the Iko-iki, made up of devout followers whose resistance is fueled as much by faith as by any military strategy. That combination makes them dangerous in a way that's difficult to fully prepare for. Soldiers who fear death less than they fear failing their beliefs tend to fight with a stubbornness that outlasts more conventional armies. You're placed under Shibata Katsui for this campaign, one of Nobunaga's most senior and trusted commanders, exacting man whose reputation for discipline precedes him into every room he enters. There's an adjustment required in serving under someone else's direct command after years of increasing autonomy. A small swallowing of pride that doesn't come naturally to you, but that you manage anyway. Because the alternative, letting personal preference interfere with a campaign this important, isn't something you're willing to risk. The fighting through Echizen stretches out longer than the earlier, sharper battles you've grown used to. This isn't the kind of conflict resolved in a single dramatic clash. It's grinding, methodical, village by village and stronghold by stronghold. The uprising refusing to fully collapse, even as its numbers thin. There's an exhaustion to this kind of warfare that's different from the adrenaline-fueled intensity of somewhere like Anagawa, less about surviving a single, overwhelming moment, more about simply enduring, day after day, without letting the accumulated weight of it wear down your judgment. You handle it well enough that it doesn't go unnoticed. By the time the uprising is finally suppressed, you've earned something concrete for your trouble. Land and Echizen granted directly for your role in the campaign. The first real territorial reward you've received in your own name, rather than as part of a broader unit's recognition. It's a small taste of something you'll come to know intimately in years ahead. How loyalty and competence, applied consistently enough over time, eventually translate into land, and land translates into everything else. There isn't much time to enjoy the new holdings, though. Nobunaga's ambitions keep expanding faster than anyone around him can fully catch their breath. And the next major confrontation arriving on the horizon is one that will end up reshaping how battles are fought in this country for generations afterward. The Takeda cavalry has a reputation that precedes it the way certain names always do in this line of work. Feared, nearly mythologized, a force that's rolled over enemy formations for years, with a momentum that seems almost impossible to counter through conventional means. Meeting them in open combat the traditional way, spear against spear, horse against horse, feels increasingly like a losing proposition the more you study what's coming. What Nobunaga proposes instead is something you haven't quite seen implemented at this scale before. Rows of matchlock gunners, positioned behind defensive palisades, organized to fire in coordinated waves rather than the more chaotic individual discharge pattern that's typically been the norm. The idea, as it's explained to you, is deceptively simple. While one row reloads, the next row fires, creating something closer to a continuous wall of gunfire rather than a single volley, followed by a long, vulnerable pause. You're given command over a portion of these matchlock units, and there's a particular unfamiliar tension to the assignment. You've spent your entire career becoming exactly the kind of soldier this new approach seems designed to eventually make obsolete. Close combat, spearwork, the kind of individual battlefield prowess that earned you your nickname in the first place. Standing behind a palisade directing coordinated gunfire feels, at first, almost like a demotion, even though you understand intellectually that it isn't. The morning of the battle carries a specific tension that's different from what you've grown used to. There's less of the raw physical anticipation that comes before close combat, and more of a colder, more clinical waiting, watching the horizon for the first signs of the Takeda cavalry's approach, running through the timing of the volley sequence in your head over and over. Aware that the whole strategy depends on discipline holding under pressure rather than individual heroics carrying the day. When the cavalry finally comes, it comes with the terrifying momentum you've been warned about. A wall of horses and riders, bearing down with a speed that makes the palisades in front of you feel suddenly very thin and very inadequate. The instinct to simply brace for impact, to meet the charge the old way, is almost overwhelming. The volleys begin instead. Row after row, the coordinated rhythm holding despite the chaos, gunfire tearing through the leading edge of the cavalry charge with a devastating consistency that the old individual fire approach could never have managed. You watch it happen from your position, directing your section of gunners through the sequence. And there's something almost disorienting about witnessing a battle won this way. Not through the kind of desperate, personal combat that's defined every fight of your life up to this point, but through coordination, timing, and a willingness to trust an unfamiliar strategy over the instincts that have kept you alive for decades. It works. The Takeda cavalry, for all its fearsome reputation, breaks against the sustained gunfire in a way that stuns even the men who planned for exactly this outcome. It's not a clean victory in the sense of being bloodless or elegant. The field afterward is a horror in its own particular way. The wreckage of an entire cavalry tradition scattered across ground that gunfire has reshaped the meaning of warfare on. But it is, undeniably, a victory, and one that will be studied and referenced for generations after this particular afternoon fades from living memory. You don't escape the day unmarked. Somewhere in the confusion, even behind the relative safety of the palisades, a wound finds its way to your right leg. Not catastrophic, but enough to slow you noticeably in the days that follow. Enough that you'll carry a faint reminder of this battle in your gait for longer than you'd like to admit. There's something almost fitting about it, a physical mark from the battle that proved close combat alone isn't enough to guarantee survival anymore. Not against an enemy willing to reinvent the terms of engagement entirely. That night, sitting with your leg elevated and throbbing in a low, persistent way that makes sleep difficult, you find yourself turning the whole day over in your mind. There's a strange grief buried somewhere in the victory, one you don't fully articulate even to yourself, a recognition that the kind of warfare you built your entire reputation on, spear against spear, skill against skill, is slowly being eclipsed by something colder and more mechanical. The world you were shaped for is quietly giving way to a different one. You don't resent it exactly. You're too practical for that, and too aware that clinging to an outdated approach out of nostalgia would be its own kind of foolishness. But there's an adjustment required, a small mourning for the version of soldiering you first fell in love with as a boy holding a spear in a quiet courtyard, even as you recognize that the future clearly belongs to whoever adapts fastest to what's coming next. Outside, the camp settles into the particular hush that follows a battle of this scale, exhausted men finding whatever rest they can manage before tomorrow's demands arrive. You let the ache in your leg anchor you to the present moment, a reminder that survival, in this line of work, has never been about avoiding cost. It's only ever been about deciding what cost is worth paying and continuing forward anyway. Not every battle bends the way you expect it to, and Tedorigawa arrives as a hard lesson in exactly that. A reminder that momentum built across years of victories can still be broken in a single afternoon by an opponent who simply understands the ground better than you do. Uesugi Kenshin's name carries a particular weight among the commanders you serve alongside. Grudging respect reserved for someone whose reputation has survived scrutiny rather than simply outlived doubt. He spent years earning that reputation the hard way, through victories that weren't lucky so much as inevitable. The product of a mind that seems to read battlefields the way other men read simple text. Your leg has mostly healed by the time this campaign begins, though there's a stiffness in cold weather now that wasn't there before Nagashino. A small tax the previous battle left behind that you've simply learned to work around. You march north with the rest of Nobunaga's forces, carrying the accumulated confidence of a string of hard-won successes. And if there's a note of overconfidence buried somewhere in that mood, it's not one anyone around you seems inclined to examine too closely. The terrain near the river works against you almost immediately, in ways that become clear only in hindsight, the kind of clarity that always arrives too late to be useful. Uesugi's forces have positioned themselves with an understanding of the ground that your own side hasn't matched. And what follows isn't the kind of battle where individual skill or matchlock discipline can fully compensate for a strategic disadvantage baked into the terrain itself. You fight hard. That much is true regardless of the outcome. The same instinctive focus you've relied on since Ieyasu, carrying you through exchange after exchange, even as the broader shape of the battle turns against your side. But there's a particular, sickening clarity that settles over a battlefield once you realize the fight itself has already been lost, even if the actual fighting hasn't stopped yet. A feeling entirely different from the desperate uncertainty of somewhere like Okahazama, where the outcome was genuinely unknown until the very end. The retreat, when it comes, is not orderly. Retreats rarely are, whatever the more polished accounts written decades later might suggest. There's a chaos to disengaging from a losing position that tests discipline more than almost anything in open combat does. And you spend the worst hours of that day less concerned with striking enemies than with simply keeping the men around you moving in a coherent direction, away from a battlefield that's stopped belonging to your side. It's a genuine defeat, one of the few in your career that can't be reframed or softened into something more flattering. Nobunaga's forces are smashed badly enough that the loss becomes a real setback to his broader ambitions in the region. A reminder, circulated quietly among the retainers afterward, that even the most formidable commanders occasionally run into someone better prepared for that particular fight, on that particular day. There's a temptation, in the aftermath of something like this, to spiral into the kind of self-recrimination that helped ruin you once before, back in your ronin days, when a moment of unchecked frustration cost you everything. You recognize that pull this time, though, in a way you couldn't back then. The difference between the reckless young man who killed a Doboshu over wounded pride and the man sitting here now, older, more measured, isn't that the frustration feels any less sharp. It's that you've learned, slowly and at real cost, how to sit with it without letting it drive you into something destructive. What you do instead, in the weeks following the defeat, is what you've quietly become good at over the years, without ever fully naming it as a skill, absorbing the lesson, adjusting, and continuing forward without letting a single loss define the whole of what you're building. Kenshin, for all his brilliance on that particular day, is fighting his own battles elsewhere, stretched across a country that has no shortage of ambitious men testing each other's limits. Nobunaga's broader campaign doesn't collapse because of one defeat. However painful, it reorganizes, regroups, and keeps expanding. And somewhere in that reorganization, your own standing, battered by Tedorigawa but not broken by it, continues its slow, steady climb regardless. The recognition arrives a few years later. Once the dust from that particular defeat has settled into something closer to old history than fresh wound. Noto Province, newly secured through the broader campaign's continued momentum, needs a lord capable of managing it. Someone with the administrative steadiness to hold territory once it's been won, not just the battlefield skill to win it in the first place. It's the kind of assignment that requires trust built over decades rather than a single dramatic victory, and by this point, decades are exactly what you have behind you. The province is assessed at 230,000 koku, a figure large enough to genuinely elevate your standing among Nobunaga's retainers, transforming you from a highly capable officer into something closer to a proper daimyo in your own right, a lord with real territory, real revenue, real responsibility for the people living within your borders, rather than simply the men fighting under your banner. There's a particular quiet satisfaction in this moment that feels different from the loud, adrenaline-soaked triumph of a battlefield victory. This is slower, steadier, the kind of recognition that comes not from a single dramatic act, but from the accumulated weight of years spent proving, over and over, in victory and in defeat both, that you can be relied upon. Matsu takes the news with characteristic practicality, already turning her attention toward what governing an actual province will require. The logistics of it, the administrative structure, the particular challenges of managing people, rather than simply managing an army. It's a different kind of work than either of you has done before, and there's something almost exciting in that novelty. A fresh challenge after so many years defined primarily by combat. You think back, sometimes, in the quiet evenings that follow this new appointment, to the anxious young page standing rigid in a courtyard, memorizing sandalwear patterns and holding a spear like it was the only steady thing in an unsteady world. That boy had no way of imagining a future where he'd be responsible for an entire province, its people, its harvests, its defense. No framework yet for understanding that the qualities that made him useful as a soldier, discipline, careful observation, quiet reliability, would eventually make him useful as something far larger than a soldier. There's still a long road ahead, more battles waiting on a horizon you can't fully see yet, more turns of fortune both good and devastating still to come. But sitting here now, holding the weight of a province in your hands for the first time, it's hard not to feel that whatever comes next, you've earned the standing to meet it properly. The messenger arrives at an hour that immediately tells you something is wrong, long before he manages to get a single coherent word out. There's a particular quality to bad news delivered in the middle of the night. The way it announces itself through the mere fact of its timing, before content ever catches up to dread. You're roused from sleep by the sound of raised voices somewhere near the entrance of your residence, and, by the time you've pulled on enough clothing to be presentable, the household has already begun to gather in that specific, hushed way people cluster together when they sense something has shifted permanently. Nobunaga is dead. The words don't land properly at first. You've heard rumors of his death before, false ones, the kind of battlefield gossip that spreads faster than any actual information ever could. Your first instinct is skepticism, a reflexive need to verify before allowing yourself to feel anything. But the messenger's account carries a specificity that rumors usually lack. Honnoji, a temple in Kyoto where Nobunaga had been staying with a minimal guard, betrayed from within his own ranks by a general everyone assumed was loyal. Surrounded. No escape. By most accounts, he took his own life rather than be captured. The temple burning around him as the betrayal completed itself. There's a particular kind of grief that comes with losing a lord you've served since childhood. one that's tangled up with so many other things it's hard to isolate what exactly you're mourning. The boy who called you Inu. The man who tested your loyalty and eventually trusted it completely. The architect of an ambition so vast it reshaped an entire country, cut down not by a rival warlord in open battle, the way you might have expected, but by treachery from someone who should have been protecting him. You think, in the disoriented hours that follow, of that courtyard so many years ago, the careful stillness you learned there, the sandals you memorized, the particular unreadable expression Nobunaga wore when he was deciding what a person was worth. It feels impossible that the man behind that expression is simply gone now, reduced to smoke and ash in a temple in Kyoto. His decades of careful, ruthless empire building suddenly hanging in the balance, with no clear hand to steady it. The practical reality of what comes next asserts itself quickly, the way it has to, grief or no grief. Nobunaga's death doesn't just remove a man. It removes the entire center of gravity that's been holding together an alliance of ambitious, capable commanders, each of whom has spent years serving a singular vision that no longer has anyone clearly in charge of it. Vacuums like this don't stay empty for long, not among men who've spent their whole lives learning to recognize opportunity in exactly this kind of chaos. You're aware, even in the earliest hours of processing the news, that a decision is coming that you won't be able to avoid, a question of loyalty that will require you to choose a side in whatever struggle inevitably follows. Shibata Katsuie, the stern commander you served under during the Echizen campaign years ago, is among the most senior of Nobunaga's remaining generals, and your prior service under him creates an expectation, unspoken but very much present, about where your loyalty should naturally fall. There's another name already circulating through the anxious conversations happening across the household and the wider retainer network in these early days. Hideyoshi, the same restless, talkative boy from your shared youth, the monkey to your dog, has grown into one of Nobunaga's most capable and ambitious generals, and word arrives that he's moving with remarkable speed to position himself as Nobunaga's true avenger, already engaging the very general responsible for the betrayal before most of the rest of the country has fully absorbed what happened. It's strange sitting with that information, turning over the shape of a friendship that started when you were both barely more than children and has somehow, without either of you quite planning it, arrived at a moment where you might end up standing on opposite sides of history's next chapter. You've never doubted his cleverness. You've watched it work rooms and battlefields alike for decades now. What you're less certain of, in these uncertain early days, is what that cleverness intends to build out of the wreckage Nobunaga's death has left behind. Matsu finds you sitting alone later that night, the household finally quiet again after the initial shock has settled into something more like grim, watchful waiting. She doesn't offer easy comfort, which you're grateful for. False reassurance would feel hollow given the scale of what's actually happened. What she offers instead is the same steady practicality that's carried your household through every crisis so far. A quiet reminder that grief and strategy don't have to be mutually exclusive. That you're allowed to mourn a man you served for decades, while also thinking clearly about what his absence means for everyone who depends on you now. You sit with her a long while in the dim light, neither of you speaking much, listening to the unfamiliar quiet of a household still absorbing news that will reshape everything that follows, somewhere beyond your walls. Similar conversations are happening in 100 other households across the region. Commanders and their families all wrestling with the same sudden, disorienting question of what comes next when the man who gave your ambitions their shape and direction is no longer there to answer for them. There's no clean resolution available tonight, no decision that needs to be made before morning. But you already sense, sitting in that quiet room with the woman who's built a life alongside you through every previous turn of fortune, that the coming weeks will ask something difficult of you, a choice between old loyalty and something else you can't quite name yet, a calculation about survival an advancement that Nobunaga's death has forced onto every ambitious man in his former service, whether they're ready for it or not. You don't sleep much that night. You lie awake turning over decades of memory. The arrow at Kaiyazu, the heads at Okehazama, the red cloak at Anagawa, the whole long, hard-won climb from anxious page to provincial lord. All of it suddenly recontextualized by the absence of the single man who made every step of that climb possible. Whatever comes next, you understand, will require you to build on that foundation without the foundation's original architect standing behind you anymore. For the first time in a long while, the future feels genuinely uncertain, and there's no comfort in pretending otherwise. The weeks after Nobunaga's death settle into a tense, uneasy holding pattern, the kind of quiet that doesn't feel like peace, so much as the pause before something inevitable finally breaks loose. Hideyoshi moves fast, faster than anyone quite expects, cornering and defeating the general responsible for the betrayal at Honnoji before the rest of the country has even finished absorbing the shock of Nobunaga's death. The kind of speed and decisiveness that reminds you why the talkative boy from your shared youth grew into someone worth taking seriously. But avenging Nobunaga and inheriting his authority turn out to be two very different accomplishments, and the question of who actually leads what's left of the old order doesn't resolve itself nearly as cleanly as the initial act of vengeance did. Shibata Katsui, the man you served under during the long grinding campaign through Echizen, emerges as Hideyoshi's most serious rival for that inheritance, a senior, respected commander with legitimate claims to authority that Hideyoshi's own rapid rise can't entirely erase. And you find yourself, through the accumulated weight of years of prior service, standing on Katsui's side of a divide that's widening faster than either man seems willing to acknowledge out loud. There's a particular discomfort to this positioning that you don't fully articulate to anyone, not even Matsu, though you suspect she reads it in you anyway, the way she's always read things in you that you haven't said aloud. Katsui is a capable commander, disciplined and thorough, the kind of man you respected genuinely during your years serving under him. But respect for a commander's competence isn't the same as certainty about his cause. And, somewhere underneath the loyalty you owe him, sits a quieter, more troubling calculation you've been avoiding looking at too directly. Hideyoshi is winning. Not just individual battles, but the broader contest for legitimacy that matters more, in the long run, than any single engagement. He's positioning himself as Nobunaga's true heir, with a political skill that goes far beyond what you remember of the grinning, talkative boy who used to charm his way out of every scrape as a child. Whatever the two of you once were to each other, you're watching him become something considerably larger than an old friend now. And the gap between that and your current position, standing opposed to him on Katsui's side, feels increasingly untenable the longer you sit with it. The campaign that eventually brings the tension to a head unfolds near Shizugatake, a stretch of mountainous terrain that becomes the staging ground for what everyone involved understands, without needing to say it aloud, is the decisive confrontation in this whole uncertain struggle for Nobunaga's legacy. You take the field initially on Katsui's side, honoring the loyalty that's carried you through years of prior service under his command, even as the private calculation you've been avoiding grows louder with every passing day. The fighting itself is fierce, fought across difficult terrain that favors neither side cleanly, the kind of engagement where the outcome feels genuinely uncertain, even to the men directing it from close range. You fight with the same discipline you've brought to every battle since Keizu, spear and command both, and there's a strange dissonance to giving your full effort toward an outcome some part of you has already begun to doubt. It's in the middle of this uncertainty, watching how the battle's broader momentum begins tilting decisively away from Katsui's forces, that the calculation you've been avoiding finally forces itself into something you can no longer postpone. This isn't cowardice, whatever the harshest retellings might eventually suggest. It's the same clear-eyed pragmatism that's carried you through every major turning point of your life since the disaster of your youthful exile taught you the cost of letting pride override judgment. Katsui's cause is failing. Continuing to bind your fate to a losing position, out of loyalty alone, risks everything you've built, not just for yourself, but for Matsu, for your children, for the household that depends on your judgment being sound, even when sound judgment requires an uncomfortable choice. You surrender your position, and in the days that follow, formally switch your allegiance to Hideyoshi. There's no pretending this is a comfortable moment, and you don't try to dress it up as anything nobler than what it plainly is. A decision made under pressure, weighing loyalty against survival and choosing survival. The way most practical men eventually do when the alternative is annihilation alongside a cause that's already lost. Katsue, you'll learn afterward, doesn't survive the aftermath of his defeat. Whatever guilt sits alongside your relief at that news is something you carry quietly, without much desire to examine it too closely in front of anyone else. What follows your decision, though, catches you slightly off guard in its generosity. Hideyoshi doesn't merely spare you the bare minimum you might have reasonably hoped for, given the circumstances. He welcomes you with a warmth that feels genuine, rather than merely strategic, back into the fold of an old friendship that survived, apparently, the strange detour of having briefly stood on opposite sides of a mountain. And then comes the announcement that changes the entire trajectory of everything that follows for the rest of your life. Kaga Province, fertile, well-positioned, rich with agricultural and mineral potential that few outside the region fully appreciate yet, is placed under your control. You don't fully grasp, standing there receiving this appointment, exactly what it will eventually become. Kaga, on this particular day, is simply new territory, another responsibility added to Noto, another province to govern and defend and integrate into whatever larger structure Hideyoshi is building out of Nobunaga's old ambitions. You have no way of knowing yet that this modest-sounding grant of land is the actual seed of something that will eventually make you the wealthiest daimyo in the entire country, second only to whoever eventually claims the shogunate itself. Matsu receives the news with her characteristic blend of practicality and quiet ambition, already turning her attention toward the logistics of managing an expanded domain before you've even finished processing the emotional weight of the decision that got you here. There's comfort in that, in her steadiness, a reminder that whatever guilt or uncertainty sits underneath today's outcome, the path forward is one you'll walk with a partner every bit as capable as you are of building something lasting out of difficult beginnings. You look out that evening over territory that until very recently belonged to someone else entirely, and you feel the particular vertigo of a life that's just pivoted sharply onto a path you couldn't have predicted even a season ago. The anxious page, the disgraced ronin, the wounded soldier behind the palisades at Nagashino, the defeated commander retreating from Tedorigawa, all of it has led, through choices both proud and difficult, to this moment, standing at the edge of a province that will one day be spoken of as the richest in Japan. You don't know that yet. Tonight, you know only that you've survived a choice that could have ended you, and that whatever comes next will have to be built patiently and carefully on the uncertain foundation of a decision you're still not entirely at peace with, however necessary it was. Peace, once again, refuses to hold for long. It's becoming something of a pattern in your life by now. This rhythm of hard-won calm, followed almost immediately by the next threat gathering somewhere on the horizon. Enough that you've stopped expecting rest to last, and started simply making the most of it while it does. The trouble this time comes wearing a familiar shape, a rival commander, unwilling to accept the new order that Hideyoshi's rapid consolidation of power has imposed on the country. Sasa Narimasa, a capable and stubborn opponent, aligned with forces resistant to Hideyoshi's growing authority, sets his sights on your newly acquired territory in Kaga, with the kind of focused ambition that suggests he's identified you specifically as the softest point in Hideyoshi's expanding sphere of control, a lord still settling into unfamiliar land, not yet fully entrenched, ripe for testing. He's not entirely wrong to see opportunity there. Kaga is new to you in ways that Noto no longer is. The administrative structure is still being built rather than fully established. The loyalty of local populations still more assumption than certainty. If there's a moment in your tenure as a daimyo where you're genuinely vulnerable, this is probably it. Suemori Castle sits at the heart of what Narimasa intends to take from you. A fortification that matters less for its individual strength than for what its fall would signal. That the new Toyotomi order, barely a year or two into existence, can already be chipped away at by anyone willing to press hard enough. You understand the stakes clearly enough that there's no real debate, internally or with Matsu, about whether this fight is worth committing to fully. It has to hold. The siege that follows tests something different in you than the open-field battles that built your earlier reputation. There's no cavalry charge to meet head-on here, no single decisive clash where skill and timing carry the day in an afternoon. This is slower, grinding work. Supply lines, defensive positioning, the patient calculation of how long a garrison can hold against sustained pressure before something has to give. You threw yourself into the defense with the same focused intensity that's carried you through every prior crisis, though the shape of that intensity looks different now than it did chasing down an archer at Kayazu or standing behind the palisades at Nagashino. This is a general's work more than a soldier's, coordinating defenses across multiple points, managing morale among men who can feel the pressure of a prolonged siege wearing at their nerves in ways a single sharp battle never quite does. Matsu's steady hand proves invaluable again during this stretch, her logistical instincts keeping the defenders adequately supplied even as the siege drags on longer than anyone initially hoped it might. There's something almost humbling in watching how seamlessly the two of you have settled into this division of labor over the years. You holding the walls, her ensuring there's enough behind those walls to hold them with. Neither role works without the other, a truth you're more willing to acknowledge openly now than you might have been as a younger, prouder man, still trying to prove himself entirely through his own hands. Narimasa presses hard, testing weaknesses along the defensive perimeter with the persistence of a commander who genuinely believes the castle can be broken if he simply maintains enough pressure long enough. There are nights during this siege where the outcome feels genuinely uncertain, where you lie awake running through contingencies for a defeat you're not willing to voice aloud to anyone, not even yourself, for fear of somehow making it more real. Not through any single dramatic turning point, but through the accumulated weight of careful preparation, disciplined defense, and the kind of patient endurance that doesn't make for exciting storytelling, but wins wars just as effectively as any cavalry charge. Narimasa's forces, unable to break through and increasingly stretched thin by a siege that's cost them far more than they anticipated, eventually withdraw. The immediate threat to your hold on Kaga dissolving as quickly as it arrived. There's a particular satisfaction to this kind of victory that's different from the battlefield triumphs of your younger years. Quieter and less immediately gratifying, but arguably more meaningful in what it proves. Onagawa and Nagashino demonstrated that you could fight. Suemori demonstrates something else entirely. That you can govern. That territory placed under your care will remain under your care, even when tested directly. That Hideyoshi's decision to trust you with this rich, newly acquired province wasn't a miscalculation. Word of the successful defense travels back to Hideyoshi in terms that solidify your standing further. Another piece of evidence in the growing case that you're exactly the kind of steady, reliable ally worth continuing to reward. It's a different currency than the reputation you built as a young man with a spear, but you're coming to understand that it's the currency that actually matters most as your responsibilities grow larger and larger. In the aftermath, walking the repaired walls of Suemori with Matsu at your side, surveying territory that very nearly slipped out of your control, there's a moment of quiet reflection that settles over both of you. This is what holding power actually looks like, you're realizing. Far more often than the dramatic clashes that get remembered in songs and later retellings. It looks like this. Long, unglamorous stretches of vigilance, punctuated by moments of real crisis that test whether all that patient preparation was worth the effort. It was. The castle stands, the province remains yours. And somewhere in the quiet satisfaction of that outcome, you feel the first genuine sense that Kaga isn't simply a temporary assignment, or a reward that might be reconsidered if you falter. It's beginning to feel like home, in the particular way that land only starts to feel like home once you've bled and struggled to keep it. You don't yet know how much this province is capable of becoming, how the fertile plains stretching out beyond these walls, the rivers still waiting for proper management, the mineral wealth buried in ground nobody's fully surveyed yet, will eventually combine into something far larger than either you or Hideyoshi currently imagines. Tonight, standing on walls that held against everything thrown at them, you know only that the foundation is secure, and that whatever gets built on top of it now has a real chance to last. The years that follow Suemori settle into something you haven't experienced in a long while. Sustained, uninterrupted stability, long enough that you find yourself, more than once, almost suspicious of it, waiting for the next crisis to announce itself, the way it always has before. It doesn't come, not for a good long while, and slowly, cautiously, you allow yourself to actually use that stability for something other than simply bracing against its end. What you build, in this stretch of relative peace, isn't a fortress or a battle line. It's an economy, and it turns out to require a different kind of patience than warfare ever did. The kind measured in seasons and harvests, rather than the sharp, adrenaline-soaked minutes of combat. Kaga, Noto, and Echu together form a stretch of territory blessed with a particular kind of geographic luck that you're only now beginning to fully appreciate. Fertile plains, threaded through with rivers, soil that responds generously to careful cultivation, terrain that rewards exactly the kind of long-term investment a lord secure in his holdings can afford to make. The Kakehashi River, in its natural state, floods with a regularity that's made large stretches of otherwise excellent farmland unreliable for generations. You commission the flood control work anyway, extensive channels and embankments that take years rather than months, an investment that won't show its full return until long after the immediate expense has been forgotten by anyone but your own ledgers. It pays off, eventually, in the way patient investments tend to. Land that used to flood unpredictably becomes some of the most productive rice paddies in the entire domain. You expand the irrigation further than the original flood control required, reclaiming stretches of marginal land that previous administrations never bothered attempting to cultivate. Each new field adding incrementally to a total yield that's climbing faster than even your own optimistic projections. The official assessment, when the surveyors finally tally the full extent of what your domain now produces, comes back at a figure that takes even you a moment to fully absorb. Over 1,000,000 koku, officially recorded, with the actual harvest running higher still, once you account for the reclaimed land and improved yields that haven't yet been formally reassessed. A koku, you're reminded by the men doing the counting, represents roughly enough rice to feed one person for a full year. Your domain, on paper alone, could sustain more than 1,000,000 people. There's a particular vertigo to that number, one that doesn't fully translate into feeling, even as you understand it intellectually. You think back sometimes to the young ronin sleeping rough on the outskirts of Owari, with nothing but a spear and a stubborn refusal to accept exile as a permanent condition. That version of yourself would have found this number simply incomprehensible, a figure belonging to some other kind of person entirely. The comparison that actually puts the number into perspective arrives later, in conversation with retainers familiar with how the rest of the country's holdings stack up. A man is generally considered worthy of the title Daimyo once his lands produce 10,000 koku, a threshold your own domain now clears by a factor of over 100. Among the daimyo scattered across the country, none comes close to matching what Kaga, Noto, and Echu now produce combined. Only the Tokugawa themselves, whose own holdings dwarf even yours at somewhere near 8 million koku, sit clearly above you in raw wealth, Everyone else, every other lord who once might have looked down on you as merely one province holder among many, now looks distinctly smaller by comparison. It's not only rice that builds this fortune either, and you've made a deliberate point of not letting the whole domain's prosperity rest on a single crop vulnerable to a single bad season. The Hidatsu mine, worked with increasing sophistication, pulls gold from the earth in quantities that add a whole separate stream of wealth flowing into your treasury, one that doesn't depend on weather or harvest timing at all. Positioned well along routes that merchant ships have started favoring more and more, benefit from the growing Kitame-bune shipping trade, vessels carrying rice, textiles, and regional goods up and down the coast, each one passing through waters your domain has some claim over, each one adding a small toll of prosperity that accumulates the way individual raindrops accumulate into a river. You've pushed cultivation beyond rice as well, encouraging tea, silk, and lacquer production across stretches of land less suited to grain but perfectly capable of supporting these other more specialized goods. It's a hedge, in the practical sense, a domain diversified enough that no single failure can genuinely threaten the whole structure. But it's also becoming something more than simple economic strategy. These crafts are starting to develop a reputation of their own. Artisans drawn to the domain by steady patronage and the promise of stable work, each one adding another thread to a growing tapestry of prosperity that extends well beyond the fields. Kanazawa, at the center of all this, has stopped feeling like a modest provincial capital and started feeling like something considerably larger, a town growing almost visibly year over year, as merchants and craftsmen and administrators flow in to serve a domain whose wealth keeps expanding faster than the infrastructure can quite keep pace with. There's a particular pleasure in walking its streets now, watching the small, unglamorous work of years, flood control, irrigation, mining, trade agreements, compound into something you can actually see and hear and smell, in the bustle of a marketplace that didn't exist in anything like this scale when you first took possession of this land. Matsu walks these same streets beside you often, her own contributions to this prosperity running quieter, but no less essential than yours. The household management skills that once coordinated grain for 20,000 soldiers now applied to something even larger, the administration of an entire domain's daily functioning. You've built this together, in the truest sense, each of you contributing exactly the particular competence the other lacked. There's a warning buried somewhere in this success too, one you're only beginning to sense rather than fully articulate. Wealth on this scale doesn't go unnoticed, not in a country still settling into a new political order under Hideyoshi's authority, where every ambitious lord is being watched carefully for signs of overreach. Being the richest daimyo in Japan, you're starting to understand, isn't simply a triumph to enjoy quietly, a target painted onto your back by the sheer scale of what you've built. Whether you intended that or not, you file that concern away for now, a problem to be managed rather than solved outright, and let yourself for one more evening simply appreciate the particular satisfaction of standing in a thriving city that exists, in no small part, because of decisions you made and risks you took and patient years of investment that could easily have failed, but didn't. The fields stretch out beyond Kanazawa's walls, heavy with grain, and somewhere beyond them the mines keep producing, and the ships keep sailing, and the whole vast machine of your domain's prosperity keeps turning, one harvest and one season at a time. The warning you filed away in your mind doesn't fade the way some concerns do with time. If anything, the more Kanazawa grows, the sharper that low, persistent awareness becomes. The sense that a domain wealthy enough to sustain over 1 million people is also a domain wealthy enough to arm an army nobody else in the country could easily match. And that this fact hasn't escaped the notice of men far more suspicious than you'd like. You've required, for some time now, that your samurai live within Kanazawa itself, rather than scattered across smaller garrisons throughout the countryside. A decision made partly for administrative efficiency, partly for the simple military logic of keeping your fighting men close and organized rather than diffuse. The consequence of that policy has become impossible to ignore just by walking the city. Samurai estates now occupy something close to 70% of Kanazawa's total land, an astonishing proportion that transforms the whole character of the town. This isn't simply a wealthy merchant city with a garrison attached to it. It's a city built, fundamentally, around the presence of warriors. Among those warriors, a particular tier stands apart from the rest, distinguished not just by rank, but by a wealth so substantial it borders on absurd when you actually stop to consider it. The Kaga Haka, the 8 houses of Kaga, are your most senior retainers, families who've served alongside you and your predecessors long enough to accumulate holdings that would qualify most of them as daimyo in their own right, were they operating anywhere else in the country. Their estates sprawl across sections of Kanazawa so extensive they function almost as separate towns nested within the larger city, complete with their own retinues of samurai, their own household staff, their own small internal economies humming along beneath the larger economy of the domain itself. You walk past the Honda estate sometimes, the wealthiest of these 8 houses, and there's a particular vertigo in registering just how much land, how many armed men, how much accumulated fortune sits behind those walls. All of it technically loyal to you, all of it also, if you're being fully honest with yourself, a small kingdom unto itself that you have to manage as carefully as you'd manage relations with any neighboring lord. Power distributed this widely doesn't disappear. It simply changes shape, becomes something you negotiate with, rather than something you command outright. The military capacity all of this represents is not small. Beyond the 8 houses and their personal forces, your domain maintains standing units of ashigaru, the foot soldiers who form the backbone of any serious army in this era, organized and drilled with the same rigor you learned to value during your own years serving under Nobunaga. Spearmen, Biyari ashigaru, trained in coordinated formation fighting, rather than the individual heroics that once defined your own reputation, stand ready in numbers that could, if circumstances required it, be mustered into a force capable of overwhelming most rivals in the country. Alongside them, matchlock units carry forward the lesson Nagashino taught you decades ago, drilled in the same volley discipline that broke the Takeda cavalry that terrible, instructive afternoon. You know these numbers intimately, the way any competent lord has to. You know how many men could be armed and mustered within days if the need arose, how many muskets sit in storage, how many spear shafts and arrowheads your armories hold in reserve. Not because it's secret exactly, but because saying it aloud too often, in the wrong company, has a way of sounding less like pride and more like threat. And that, precisely, is the problem you've been quietly working to solve. A domain, this wealthy, this well-armed, sitting one province away from the seat of national power, cannot simply exist without inviting scrutiny. You've watched enough of your peers rise and fall across your lifetime to understand exactly how quickly accumulated strength gets reinterpreted as accumulated ambition, how easily a lord's private prosperity becomes, in the eyes of a nervous central authority, evidence of designs on something larger. Hideyoshi himself has grown more careful in recent years, more watchful of exactly this kind of concentrated regional power. And you have no illusions about which domains sit near the top of any list of concerns he might privately be keeping. So you've made a choice, deliberate and sustained, about where to direct the surplus your domain keeps producing. Not toward larger armies than you already maintain, not toward fortifications aggressive enough to read as preparation for conflict. Instead, toward something that announces refinement rather than menace. Tea ceremony, no theater, gold leaf work, silk weaving, the whole elaborate apparatus of cultural patronage that a domain with genuine hostile intentions would have little patience to bother cultivating. You've invited artisans from Kyoto to settle in Kanazawa, master craftsmen in gold leaf application, a technique so demanding and precise that supporting it properly requires exactly the kind of stable, long-term investment a lord planning rebellion would never prioritize. Tea masters instruct your retainers in the elaborate, unhurried rituals of the ceremony, an entire discipline built around patience and restraint that stands in deliberate harmony with the cultivated peace of the domain. Visible contrast to whatever image of a war-hungry provincial lord someone in the capital might otherwise be tempted to construct. It's not deception exactly, or not only deception. There's a genuine pleasure that's grown in you, watching Kanazawa develop its own distinct cultural character, watching the lacquerware and textiles produced within your domain start to earn reputations that extend well beyond your own borders. But you're honest enough with yourself, in the quiet hours when you review the household ledgers, alongside Matsu, to recognize the strategic function running underneath the genuine appreciation. Every gold-leafed screen, every tea house built with painstaking attention to aesthetic detail, every no performance staged with lavish expense, serves double duty, a genuine cultural achievement, and a carefully constructed message aimed at anyone in the capital who might otherwise look at your million-koku domain and see a threat rather than an ally. Matsu understands this calculation as clearly as you do, perhaps more clearly, given how much of the actual daily administration of cultivating this image falls to her steady, practical hand. She's the one, more often than not, overseeing which artisans receive patronage, which ceremonies get staged with enough visible extravagance to be noticed by the right people without tipping over into ostentation that might read as arrogance instead of loyalty. It's a delicate balance, walking that particular line, and you've come to rely on her judgment for it as much as you once relied on her logistics during actual military campaigns. Standing on the walls of Kanazawa Castle some evenings, looking out over a city that's become something genuinely singular, this dense, thriving concentration of samurai estates and artisan workshops and rice wealth beyond almost any comparison in the country. You feel the particular weight of a problem that most lords never have to seriously grapple with. It's not how to become powerful. You've already answered that question decisively over decades of battles and patient governance. The question now is how to hold power this vast without it eventually consuming you. How to remain in the eyes of a suspicious world, useful and loyal, rather than dangerous and ambitious. You don't yet know how long you'll have to keep answering that question, or how much harder it might become once Hideyoshi himself is no longer the one asking it. For tonight, the lanterns of Kanazawa flicker below you in their thousands, gold leaf glinting faintly where torchlight catches it, and the city hums with a prosperity you built with your own hands, patiently, over a lifetime that started with nothing more than a spear and a stubborn refusal to accept defeat as permanent. The summons that pulls you away from Kanazawa's cultural flourishing arrives with the particular urgency that means Hideyoshi has set his sights on something significant, and there's no version of loyalty that lets you decline. The Hojo clan, entrenched for generations in their formidable holdings to the east, have refused to bend to the new order Hideyoshi's been assembling across the rest of the country. And their continued independence has become, in his eyes, an intolerable gap in an otherwise unified Japan. You're giving command of forces marching from the north, a role that suits both your military experience and something else Hideyoshi's come to value in you over the years. Your particular talent, honed through decades of careful observation and quiet diplomacy, for reading other lords accurately and knowing exactly what argument will move them. Date Masamune proves to be exactly the kind of test that talent was made for. Young, fiercely proud, ruling territory in the north with an independence he's clearly reluctant to surrender to anyone. He represents precisely the sort of hesitant ally whose submission could tip the whole northern campaign one way or the other. You spend considerable time with him, more patience than the military timeline strictly allows for, listening as much as arguing, understanding that a man like this responds far better to being persuaded than to being merely ordered. What you offer him in the end isn't threat, but perspective, a clear-eyed accounting of what resistance would actually cost against a coalition this large, delivered without the condescension that might have stiffened his pride into outright defiance instead. It works. Masamune submits, formally, and without the drawn-out resistance many had expected, and the northern campaign proceeds considerably smoother for it. You capture Hojo-held castles across Kotsuke and Musashi in the campaigns that follow, methodical siege work that draws on everything Suemori taught you about patience and preparation, until the Hojo resistance finally collapses entirely and the country stands more fully unified than it has in generations. There's a particular satisfaction in this kind of victory, one built as much through conversation as through combat, and you carry that lesson forward into the years that follow. Years that ask increasingly less of your spear and increasingly more of your judgment. Hideyoshi's ambitions, unified Japan apparently not being sufficient to satisfy them, turn eventually toward Korea, an invasion launched with a confidence that troubles you more than you initially let yourself admit. You're given significant administrative responsibility for coordinating this campaign, though your own role keeps you in Japan, rather than on the front lines across the water, managing supply lines and logistics for a war effort that stretches Hideyoshi's resources further than almost anyone around him seems entirely comfortable acknowledging. The years drag on longer than the initial optimism anticipated, and somewhere in that long stretch, you notice something in Hideyoshi that troubles you more than any battlefield setback could. He's aging, more visibly with each passing season, and there's a restlessness in him now, a talk of personally traveling to the front lines that seems driven less by strategic necessity than by something harder to name. Pride, perhaps, or a need to prove vitality he can feel slipping. You discourage it carefully and repeatedly, drawing on the same patient persuasion that worked on Masamune, understanding that an aging man crossing to a foreign war zone risks catastrophe for reasons that have nothing to do with military logic. It's a delicate conversation to keep having, softening blunt practical concerns into something that respects his pride, even while working against his stated wishes. And you're not always certain, in these exchanges, that you're entirely succeeding. But he stays, ultimately, in Japan, and whatever quiet credit belongs to you for that outcome is not something you feel any need to claim openly. Matsu watches this whole extended chapter unfold with the same steady attention she's brought to every earlier crisis. And there are evenings during these years where the two of you sit together, reviewing correspondence from the front, the tone in her voice carrying a wariness that matches your own. War fought at this distance, managed through logistics and letters rather than direct combat, asks a different kind of endurance than anything either of you trained for in your younger years. And you both feel the accumulated toll of it more with each passing season. It's in the midst of this long, exhausting campaign that Hideyoshi makes a decision that reshapes the remaining years of your life, more thoroughly than almost anything before it. His son, Hideyori, is still a child, far too young to inherit the vast structure of authority Hideyoshi has spent his life assembling, and the question of what happens to that structure once its architect is gone has clearly been weighing on him as heavily as it's been weighing on everyone watching from outside. He assembles a council, 5 of the most senior and trusted lords in the realm, tasked jointly with the guardianship of his son and the stability of the country until Hideyori comes of age. You're named among them, the Go-Tairo, the 5 great elders, a role that carries a weight entirely different from anything you've held before. This isn't command of an army or governance of a single domain, however large. This is responsibility for the entire fragile transition of power that's coming, whether anyone is fully ready for it or not. You accept the appointment with a gravity that surprises even you, aware in a way you can't quite articulate that this is the culmination of everything the last several decades have been quietly building toward. The anxious page, who once memorized sandalwear patterns, has become one of 5 men entrusted with the fate of the entire country's next chapter. There's no triumphant feeling in this recognition, though. No swelling pride, the way there might have been decades earlier. Mostly, there's a sober awareness of exactly how much can still go wrong, and how much now depends on 5 very different men managing to hold something fragile together, without letting their own ambitions tear it apart. You already know, without needing to say it aloud to anyone, which of the other 4 elders concerns you most. Tokugawa Ieyasu sits among the 5 great elders alongside you, commanding resources and territory that dwarf even your own million-koku domain. A man whose patience and long-term strategic thinking you've observed carefully enough over the years to recognize as genuinely formidable. Whatever balance the 5 of you manage to strike in guiding young Hideyori toward his eventual inheritance, you suspect will depend enormously on whether Ieyasu's ambitions can be checked and by whom. You have a growing, uncomfortable feeling that the answer to that question may end up resting more heavily on your own shoulders than you'd like. The council doesn't meet often, not in any formal sense you could point to as a scheduled gathering. Mostly it exists as an understanding, 5 men each holding a piece of a fragile structure together through nothing more binding than mutual recognition of what collapse would cost. You feel the weight of that understanding most acutely in the quiet moments, walking the halls of Osaka Castle, where young Hideyori is being raised, watching a boy too small to understand the scale of what he's inherited play at games that have nothing to do with the empire waiting for him. Ieyasu, for his part, conducts himself with a patience that would be reassuring if you didn't know, from decades of reading men exactly like him, how much genuine ambition can hide behind patience deployed skillfully enough. He's careful in every visible action, deferential in every public gesture toward Hideyori's authority. And yet there's something in the accumulating pattern of small moves he makes, alliances quietly cultivated, marriages arranged without quite enough consultation, decisions made that technically fall within his authority, but stretch that authority further than strict interpretation would allow. That keeps a low, persistent unease running underneath your daily dealings with him. You're the one man among the 5 elders with the combined standing to actually challenge him if it comes to that. Your own domain rivals his in wealth, if not quite in raw territorial scale, and your reputation, built across 4 decades of battles and governance stretching back to a nervous boy holding trays in Nobunaga's courtyard, carries a weight that the other elders simply can't match. You understand, without anyone needing to say it aloud, that you have become the one obstacle standing between Ieyasu and whatever fuller consolidation of power he's patiently working toward. Whether he thinks of you in exactly those terms, you can't say for certain, but you'd wager he does, the same way you'd recognize the calculation in yourself if your positions were reversed. Your health has begun its own quiet retreat this past year. The accumulated toll of decades spent on battlefields and in council chambers finally asserting itself in ways that no amount of stubborn will can fully hold back. There's a particular indignity to feeling your body fail you after surviving everything it survived. An arrow to the face, a leg wound at Nagashino, siege after siege, campaign after campaign, only to be worn down eventually by nothing more dramatic than time itself. Matsu tends to you through these final months with the same steady, unsentimental care she's brought to everything else across your life together. And there's a particular tenderness in watching her manage this, the way she's managed every other crisis, refusing to let grief soften into helplessness, even as the outcome becomes harder to deny with each passing week. You talk in the quieter hours about the children, grown now, scattered across positions of real authority. The daughters married into families that matter, the sons carrying forward a name that started with nothing more than a page's modest service, and has become synonymous with the wealthiest domain in the country. You think more than once in these final months about what happens to all of it once you're no longer the one holding the balance steady. Toshinaga, your eldest, is capable, but he's inheriting a position more precarious than perhaps he fully appreciates yet, a domain wealthy enough to be envied, positioned uncomfortably close to a man whose ambitions you've spent years quietly containing, simply by remaining alive and formidable enough to matter. You call for him during one of your more lucid stretches, and the conversation you have isn't the kind that gets recorded cleanly in any official chronicle. The kind of practical, unglamorous guidance a father offers a son who's about to inherit responsibilities heavier than he's ready for. Watch Ieyasu carefully. Don't mistake his patience for passivity. Hold what we've built, but hold it wisely. know when strength alone isn't enough. Know when accommodation serves the family better than pride does. You think of your own younger self, the reckless ronin who once let pride cost him everything. And you hope, without being able to guarantee it, that the lesson has actually transferred. Death, when it finally comes, arrives at Osaka Castle in the spring, quietly, without the drama that might attend a death on some distant battlefield. You're 61, or perhaps 62 depending on which count you trust, surrounded by the family that's grown from that single practical steady marriage to a woman who could match you skill for skill in everything that mattered. There's a particular peace in that, dying among people who genuinely knew you, rather than the isolated, uncertain death that might have claimed you decades earlier as a friendless ronin, sleeping rough on the margins of a world that had cast you out. What you can't know, in your final hours, is exactly how quickly the balance you spent your last years maintaining begins shifting once you're gone. Ieyasu, freed from the one counterweight substantial enough to check him, begins moving with considerably less restraint, almost immediately. And within a year, the fragile peace fractures into open conflict, the whole country dividing itself into factions that will eventually collide at a place called Sekigahara. Toshinaga faces the choice you warned him to prepare for sooner than either of you hoped he would. Pressure comes from both directions, old loyalists urging him toward the factions still fighting for Hideyori's inheritance, while allies closer to Ieyasu argue with considerable persuasive force that opposing the coming order risks obliterating everything the family spent generations building. He chooses in the end to side with Ieyasu, a decision built less on affection than on the same clear-eyed pragmatism you taught him to value over blind loyalty to a losing cause. And Matsu, your steady, formidable Matsu, who managed armies and households, and now, in widowhood, manages the survival of an entire clan, makes the sacrifice that ultimately secures everything you built. She travels to Edo and stays there for 15 years, a living hostage offered up to erase whatever suspicion still clings to your family's enormous wealth, doing willingly what you spent your final years working desperately to avoid, absorbing the risk personally, so the domain itself never has to bear it. It works. The Maeda name doesn't just survive the transition to Tokugawa rule. It flourishes under it. Marriages woven carefully into the shogun's own family in the generations that follow. Kanazawa's cultural brilliance continuing to bloom exactly as you always intended it to. Proof of loyalty rather than evidence of threat. Precisely the balance you spent a lifetime learning how to strike. You didn't live to see any of that unfold. At the end of everything, watching the life you built stretch out behind you like a long, hard-won road from an anxious page to the guardian of an empire's most fragile transition. There's a quiet, settled satisfaction in knowing you left the people you loved as prepared as any single lifetime of vigilance could make them. The castle grows quiet now, the way it always does in these last soft hours before sleep finally claims everything. Somewhere beyond these walls, Kanazawa's lanterns are still glowing faintly gold against the dark. The tea houses settling into silence, the long rows of samurai estates finally still, after another full day of a life you spent decades building, from nothing more than a spear and a stubborn refusal to stay defeated. You can let all of it rest now. The battles are behind you. Every arrow and every wound folded quietly into memory. The wealth you gathered still flows on through fertile fields and quiet rivers, through gold catching torchlight in 100 lacquered halls, through a family grown wide and steady enough to weather whatever comes next, without you standing guard over it any longer. Let your breathing slow. Let your shoulders soften into whatever surface is holding you right now. Heavy and warm, the way a body finally allowed to rest always feels. There's nothing left to prove tonight, nothing left to defend, just the last low hum of a life fully lived, settling gently into stillness. Picture it if you can, one final time, Mist rising slow over quiet rice fields at dawn, the far-off shapes of mountains softened almost to nothing. A single lantern burning low and steady in a window somewhere close by, waiting for no one in particular, simply glowing, simply enough. Let that image hold you now. Let it carry you the rest of the way down, gently, the way a river carries something it's grown fond of toward a shore it already knows by heart.